public discourse to function in the way we need it for democracy, then we have a good Kantian reason for the state to make sure that these conditions obtain. Sorry, is this clear enough as an answer to your question?
No, yeah, that's very helpful because, well, as you explain, and as well, like Kant's conception of the state is very different from what you were mentioning, like Locke's conception of the state. So for Kant, the state is very strong and has a very important, has a lot of competent, like tasks to fulfill. It's not a minimal state in any way. So one can say that it has a lot of regulatory tasks to perform, to carry out. Yeah. And you were mentioning like the conditions for a public discourse, but one can also think of education, for example. Yeah. Like Kant doesn't say anything about it, not specific. He's, as you say, it's very important to remember the time when he was writing. But given what he says about the economy, for example, he says a few things along those lines of this, the role of the state in regulating the economy or setting the conditions for a functioning economic relations. And one can also maybe extend that reasoning or that argument for education. And so the state has to provide the conditions for the possibility of a public, as you were putting it. And it's not only newspapers, but also like educating the public for it. Would you agree with?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The only thing I was wondering about is, and you said in Kant, there is a strong role for the state beyond the mere providing of the legal framework in which people conduct their lives. I agree with you, but my impression is that this is not very much at the surface of the text. You have to dig a little to find those passages, and you have to interpret them and to construct a little in order to arrive at them. So it's not as if Kant's account is his official and explicit account of this, for instance, in the doctrine of right, would emphasize these things very strongly. Rather, it's only in side remarks. So when it comes to the economy, for instance, there's this famous remark Kant makes, not in the doctrine of right, but in the doctrine of virtue. He says that, well, people try to be virtuous in giving for charity, but they have to be aware of the fact that it was only good luck and bad government that makes the differences in wealth and income so strong that some people need charity and others can give it. Now, if you read these passages, you can infer from them that Kant was thinking, well, good government would be one in which people don't need charity, but rather in which social security is provided for everyone. But this is only a side remark in the doctrine of virtue, and does not occur in the official text, in the doctrine of right, where he deals with the state and its tasks. So I think in the end, I completely agree with you, what you're saying, but I would only want to point out that this is not something that is very much in the forefront of Kant's own thinking, and that we do have to do some interpreting here and to give Kant a helping hand, so to speak, in bring these things to the fore.
Yes, okay, thank you. No, yes, I agree with you, yes. Thank you.
So, we come now to the second point in Kant's practical philosophy, where probably we will have to dig deeper into Kant's thinking, and this is the reparation of past wrongs. Fabiola,
yes. Thank you. No, yes, I was very struck when I read this passage in your book. Well, I don't have to read it like people. When you're talking about a criticism of colonialism, and then you said what Kant says they could be used to derive far-reaching claims for reparations and restitution, and I was very struck because I would have thought that justice for Kant is forward-looking. Not, he doesn't, as far as I know, but correct me if I'm wrong, there's no place where he makes any claims about reparations or restitutions. On the contrary, like everything he says about justice seems to be like forward-looking, in particular at the level of international relations. When he talks about peace treaty, he says, I don't remember the exact wording, but the idea is that states have to like start anew, like forget, like close all grievances, past grievances, and move on. And this is something that Arthur Ripstein, in his book on the law of war and peace, emphasizes. And also you can find it in Kant's views on revolution, like after the revolution has succeeded, then like move on, the new regime is legitimate, and people, I mean, like there's no perspective from which you can look back and fix past wrongs. So I don't know whether you agree. And also this forward-looking character of Kantian justice parallels his views on morality also, where the important thing is not for you. So the important thing for you is to know how you ought to act, what you ought to do, and move on. No, it's like improve. It's not so much about correcting what you've done wrong in the past, but try to be better. So this like forward-looking character of Kantian justice and morality seems to me, I thought was that's the way I read it. I understand it. So how do you square this claim about reparations with this?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting question. I mean, first of all, I should say that when I say that we can find in Kant materials for an argument for wide-ranging retribution or reparation of past wrongs from colonialism, I didn't want to say that this is Kant's own view, but rather that we can find elements in Kant that one could appeal to in making such an argument. The next point is the elements I was thinking about were in particular Kant's account of property and his account of property transferal, which in the end means something like this. Property is legitimate if it can be traced back to legitimate acquisition. So that's at least part of Kant's argument. There is original acquisition of property, and if you can trace back your property to some original legitimate acquisition, then your own claim to property is legitimate. And all I was thinking was that, okay, if we agree that many cases of property acquisition through colonialism were not legitimate, then it follows that the following steps also weren't legitimate. Now I'm aware of the fact that Kant himself sometimes said things like, okay, but you can't dig into the past too much. And at some point you must say people own what they own, and it doesn't matter how they got it, you have to make a clean slate. But I think this refers only to the step from the state of nature to building a state, where you can then no longer, once you have a state, you can't go back and ask, okay, in 4 state times, how did someone get their possession? I think once you have a state, and you can pursue back the chain of property acquisitions, Kant is committed to the claim, if there was one bad link in it, then your present claim is no longer, at least no longer uncontested. So that was the idea I was working with. So I would say that we could argue, based on some Kantian ideas, that claims to property people now have that go back to illegal acquisition through colonialism, they are at least contestable, and they should make us rethink whether we have to do some kind of reparation. Now, you say, doesn't this conflict with Kant's generally forward-looking perspective on justice? And I want to say, yes, Kant is often forward-looking, but there's one big exception, and that is his theory of punishment, which, even though it may not be as retributivist as it looks, has one very central element for retribution. Namely, Kant says that you have to take on, so if someone has killed, they have to be killed. If someone has stolen, they have to give back the property and make compensations. Now, I'm not want to defend Kant's view here, and it's complicated and it's difficult to interpret. But all I wanted to point out here is that Kant is not always forward-looking when it comes to justice. He's also sometimes backward-looking, and so I don't think that this is not in keeping. What I've been saying is not in keeping with Kantian principles.
But in what you're saying about punishment, like a big asymmetry there is that in the case of punishment, as you explain, like Kant uses this as a criterion for the kind of punishment. And there is an authority in charge of deciding this. Whereas in the case of colonialism, it's not a criterion for something else, like looking back to what happened. So in the case of punishment, it's backward looking in the sense that we need a criterion for determining the adequate punishment for the crime. And there's an authority to do that. And in the case of colonialism, we don't have an authority to determine this. So it's completely indeterminate. Who is going to say what was illegally taken from whom, from which perspective? And that's one difficulty. So there's the asymmetry breaks down. And also, this, in the case of colonialism, you don't need a criterion for something else, like in the case of punishment. You need to look back in order, as a criterion for punishment, but not in the case of colonialism. So I would think that the analogy is not, it's not completely satisfactory, yes.
Okay, but so what about this? One might try to turn this argument around and argue as follows. Okay, you are completely right, and I think it's an important point, that we don't have any authority to decide what were the wrongs done by colonialism and what would be adequate ways of compensation. And this is in analogy to Kant's argument for moving from the state of nature to the civil state, is an argument for having international courts that can adjudicate these kinds of issues. I mean, I think one thing is very obvious. Great wrongs have been done by colonialism, and many people today still profit from those wrongs, and other people suffer from those wrongs. I think this is very hard to deny. But if that is true, you might argue, not from in Kant's own words, but in Kantian spirit, so to speak, that something has to be done about this injustice. And since within the society itself that is concerned, it is not possible to come to have an authority that is neutral, what we need is international courts of justice who help in this kind of situation by trying to hear both sides and trying to find a just solution for these kinds of problems. And I think that would be a possible way forward. I mean, obviously, when the United States today debate the issue of how much compensation would be adequate, and there are some people who say almost nothing, and other people say like 300 billion or something, or incredible numbers. Well, of course, people who discuss these issues, they are not impartial. And so Kant's main point about the uncertainty and indeterminacy of many legal issues is that because of that, we need courts. And maybe the same thing goes here.
Yes, I agree with that. But what, like I cite, if we think of like Kantian justice or Kant's conception of justice or Kant's views of justice as forward-looking, I mean, if we think of it in that way, I want to say that I prefer that view. I think that correcting past wrongs, I mean, I'm not going to deny the ills and wrongs of colonialism. And of course, you're right that people continue profiting from past wrongs. I mean, of course, but the question is how to address, I mean, if the question is how to address injustice today, like I go with Kant, if we take him as a forward-looking view of justice, that there's a lot to be done to correct injustice looking to the future. So to correct injustice now, regardless, I mean, and forget about past wrongs. The past is gone, and yes, of course, but there's a lot to be done, like with immigration, for example, or with debt today. So I think that the forward-looking view of justice is just very powerful, it seems to me. And there are good reasons to recommend it, and doesn't have the additional difficulties that correcting past wrongs have, it seems to me. But anyway, that's
yeah,
just my personal.
I understand your point, and I also, of course, see the difficulties that come with trying to correct past wrongs on this historical and this level. It's almost impossible. What I like about that perspective is that it somehow is able to undermine the sense many people seem to have, many people who still profit today from colonialism and its wrongs, that somehow what they now have is really theirs, and they have a legitimate claim to it. And therefore they argue from a position of superiority. And I think that's not correct. I think people have to be aware of the fact, people in the global north, that many of the privileges we possess are not earned by our own fair work or fair dealings, but are based on criminal or acts that are that were not legally correct. And so maybe a compromise here would be to say, yes, we have to think about the future, but in doing so, we have to be aware of the fact where our own relative positions in society come from historically. And we shouldn't leave that out of the picture.
Yes, fine. I think that was a very good compromise in the end. In order to do something forward-looking, we also have to do something backward-looking. So, Marcus, this has been a very long discussion, and I want to ask you, are you open for the last two questions?
Oh, yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, because these are about philosophy of nature or theoretical philosophy, and I'll try to make them short. There is a passage on page 252 to 53 where you refer to the gap between the a priori laws of nature and the particular laws of nature, and you refer to this gap in two ways. And I wanted to ask you if these two ways are two ways of reading Kant today, or two ways in which Kant himself refers to this gap, because they seem to be very different. And one is saying that maybe the laws of nature are chaotic and there are no regularities, despite the fact that we have this general causal law. Maybe when we look at particular sequences, we will not be able to find the particular laws, and that would be the second way of referring to it, because it's more like we are not able, even though they are there. But the first way is like maybe they are not there because nature is chaotic. So how do you think these two readings are Kant in Kant himself, or these are two different ways of reading Kant?
Yes, I mean, I think that these two views are compatible in the following way. Given Kant's transcendental philosophy and the fundamental role the principle of causality plays in nature, there are two worries one might still have. So we do know from the critique of pure reason, if we believe Kant's argument there, that nature must have a causal structure, that things do not happen just by chance, but everything that happens has a cause. And if something happens from a cause, this means that there is a law of nature somewhere in the book. But now there are two possibilities here. One is, and that's A, that laws of nature are very, very fine-grained. And perhaps also natural kinds are very fine-grained. So that basically this glass here and the glass in my glasses here, even though they are both made from glass, the laws of nature that hold for them are different. And the same again for this glass and glass that looks very similar. So it might be the case that even though there is regularity in nature, it's only on the one hand, a very, very general level, everything that happens has a cause, and on the other hand, on an extremely particular level, so that for glasses that for us are indiscernible, different laws of nature. And this would make it extremely difficult for us to find these laws of nature. But even if that is not the case, and we don't know this, if we only look at Kant's argument for transcendental philosophy, it may still be that there are laws of nature, but they are so complicated that we can't find them. So I think both is possible. Both are possibilities that are not ruled out by Kant's argument in the Principles chapter of the First Critique. And so you are right, maybe I'm not very clear in distinguishing them, but I think that they are both relevant for Kant's concern, and that so my hunch is that in the critique of the power of judgment, Kant is more concerned with the second possibility, and in the opus posthumum, he's more concerned with the first possibility. But now, yeah, please.
When you say chaotic, then you don't mean that there are no regularities, but that they are maybe at a very, very particular fine-grained level that we will not be able to discern. So this seems to be the second possibility, that although the laws are there, we will not be able to find them. And when we find some laws, maybe they apply on a certain level, but when we go down more, they don't apply anymore.
Yeah.
But in the end, every particular event must be, governed by a law. And so all comes down to the second possibility. And the problem, because I know, as you say in the book, Kant was really worried with this problem into his old age. In the Opus Posthumum, it was mainly maybe about this gap. So maybe we should read him as saying that the particularity may be so fine-grained that we will not be able to find all the laws, but not maybe in the sense that there are no laws, because it doesn't seem to be compatible to say both things.
Well, I mean, for the first possibility that there are only, so I think you're right. For Kant, there have to be laws of nature. And so what I meant by the first possibility is that these are so fine-grained that they are hard to find, but that doesn't imply that we can't find them. It means it's difficult to find them, but perhaps we can find them, perhaps we can't. And this is why I think that the two possibilities should be distinguished. And there's another reason why they should be distinguished, because even if it was not the case that laws of nature are very specific, rather, I mean, perhaps we find them in Newtonian physics and in genetics and in chemistry and everywhere. And so we have all these wonderful laws of nature. It's still possible that there are also laws of nature we cannot find. And that's, of course, Kant's view about organisms, where he thinks that the causal laws that would explain the generation of the coming to be of organisms, they are epistemically inaccessible to us. And not because they are too fine-grained or too complicated, but because of the way our minds work and because of the way organisms are structured. And these two things, unfortunately for Kant, they don't fit together because organisms are structured holistically, but our ways of explaining things are bottom up or top down, but never holistic. And so, according to Kant, there is a reason for the second possibility that is independent from the first possibility. So even if there are wonderful laws of nature we can discover, there still is one phenomenon in nature, namely organisms, for which we can never find the laws of nature that explain them, according to Kant. And so I think it's important to keep these two possibilities distinct.
Thank you, and that takes us to the last question about organisms. And what I wanted to point out is that in this chapter about teleology, you place the emphasis on the explanation of the functioning of organisms, of the laws that explain how organisms work. But there is, I think, a different interest in Kant that has to do with the origin of organisms, in a sense, the origin of the first organism from inert matter, from raw matter, as he says in some passages. So raw matter is dead matter, it's not living matter. But if organisms are matter, just matter, there must be some transition, and I think Kant considers this as real, that there must be some transition between raw matter and organisms, because if not, he would have to say God created organisms from matter, and he doesn't want to say that. He wants to give matter some credit. But he denies completely the possibility that we will understand this transition. And there's this famous passage on the Newton that would the Newton-like scientists that would explain the origin, the generation of the blade of grass, standing for the simplest organism that Kant could think about then, because microorganisms had not been discovered as far as I know. But this, I mean, Kant was very insightful in seeing that to explain the passage from raw matter to an organism would be like explaining the emergence of teleology within matter. And that is something that, for example, Descartes had no idea about. He was confident that this transition would be explained by science, but he never saw the hard problem of life, and that is, how can life emerge from inert matter, that just works by the laws of mechanics, of Newton, and mechanical laws, efficient causes. How can that explain the origin of teleology? And I think this is a very interesting point, because it shows Kant was really very insightful on the problem of the origin of organisms. It's a very hard problem for scientists as well, although every scientist believes science will crack it in the end. But, there is a hard problem there. So I just wanted to point out that you don't mention it, and maybe it would be nice to mention it if there's a future edition of the book.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the suggestion.
The motto of this chapter is paragraph 8.
From that passage, and I don't go much into that later. You're absolutely right. And I agree with you. The Kant here, as in so many other places, is extremely insightful. And he has this fantastic sense of what the real problem is. It's really amazing. And maybe Kant even has a point here that is still valid today. Namely, we know that there must be some kind of transition between inorganic and organic matter. And perhaps, as I just very briefly indicated before, perhaps there is a constitutional reason why we will never have an explanation of that transition that is satisfactory to us. Because it is a kind of explanation our minds are just not made for. As Kant thinks that the only kind of mind that would understand this kind of transition would be an intuitive intellect, one that does not work stepwise by adding cause to cause and then explaining a phenomenon, but rather that takes in the phenomenon with all its causal background, so to speak, at a glance. And our minds are not working that way. And of course, as you already, I think, as you also said, Alejandro, the emergence of so-called emergent properties, whether this is life, whether this is consciousness, whether this is something very simple like the different aggregate states, like, why is it that water comes in 3 kinds of aggregate states, namely fluid, ice, and what's it? Not fog. Sorry, vapor. Thank you. As far as I know, there are still no satisfactory explanations of these things. And maybe Kant has a point here that this has to do with the way our minds work. So that would be one possible reason why we cannot so easily come up with explanations. Yeah, but I very much welcome your suggestion. Thank you.
Well, so if nobody else has an additional point to discuss, we already have had Marcus here for almost 2 hours and a half. I would like to thank you all, and very especially Marcus, for accepting the invitation and discussing with us this very interesting book on Kant. I hope really it will enjoy very future editions, so that future generations can also profit from reading it and learning about Kant's thought and his life. And of course, also we didn't talk about the myths about Kant's life, but the myths you try to debunk, and I think it's very important also to see philosophers in a real historical perspective that is compatible with the real facts of his life. So thank you very much again. We enjoyed.
I would like to thank you. Thank you very much for your serious reading of my book and your very helpful and interesting questions, and for a very interesting and lively discussion. This was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and congratulations.
I'd like to thank Alejandro for organizing this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for bringing us together, and say hi to Gonzalo.
Hi, Fabiola. Hi. I thank you for your presentation, your attention, and for the commitment to do this kind of things. I think we have to repeat this kind of events, the presentation of relevant books. Thank you very much for all that. And
yes, thank you. There are many topics of which we could still discuss.
Lots of things. Yes.
Well, congratulations once again, Marcus.
We also thank Robert and the organizers.
Have a great day in your part of the world. Our day is already ending, so enjoy the hopefully nice fall weather, and take care, everyone.
Good night.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, organizers.
Bye, Fabiola. Bye, Pedro.